Hello! Welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to Chapter 2 of All Quiet on the Western Front. And people are already suffering. Excellent. So, as always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in this chapter, and then talk about things in a little more depth. So, Chapter 2 starts with Paul recognizing that the young soldiers in the army don't really have a life to return to. Like, the older soldiers had already started families and things like that. So they've got things that they're fighting for and things they're fighting to get back to. And Paul recognizes really at 19 they were only really beginning their lives and had that all pulled out from underneath them when the war broke out. And this is sort of, then there's this odd jump where he also recognizes that, like, Muller's interest in Kemmerich's boots comes across really weird and really selfish, but he also recognizes this is how they've been taught to survive. And if Kemmerich was going to use his boots, then Muller would never think of owning them. He'd walk barefoot over barbed wire, Paul says. But since Kemmerich can't use them anymore, trying to survive again becomes very important. We then get this interesting flashback reflection of Paul's training before they were sent to the front, which he says was really important for them because if they had been sent as sort of these eager, childish, ready to be soldiers and win the war people, they would have gone crazy the moment they entered the trenches and realized that was not how this was going to work. But that training period they went through helped them move out of some of that naivete, even if they didn't realize fully how awful it was going to be. And specifically, Paul is reflecting on his corporal, Hemmelstas, and how the power sort of corrupted him. And because he didn't like these soldiers, how he used that power to his advantage, how he punished them. And Paul names quite a few of them, like cleaning something with a toothbrush, cleaning the floor with a toothbrush, which has become almost a stereotype of army punishments. You see that in a lot of army movies and army books now. But he is giving the sense that, like, these things were here. They had to stand out in the cold, work in the mud, and sometimes Hemmertas would get in trouble for it, but other times he didn't. And it was only really when the soldiers themselves figured out how to push back and gain their own power in that relationship, specifically by actually saying, no, we will turn you in, and then later by following his orders but doing it at their own pace, was sort of this mutual respect moment found between the two groups. And that flashback ends, and the novel returns to the present time as Paul is sitting with Kemmerich as the poor man is dying. Like, this is a 19-year-old who's lost his leg. He's aware of that now. He's been informed he has lost his leg, and he is aware he is dying. So we have this scene where Paul is actually trying to convince him he's not, trying to convince him he'll be going home. He even tells him stories about one of the nicer recovery hospitals, where it's this beautiful place, fresh air, good food, you might even get to play piano if you'd like. And unfortunately all this does is make Kemmerich cry silently before he eventually enters his death throes and dies. And Paul does try and help him. He runs to try and get a doctor, but the doctors are just dealing with so many people, and the orderlies are dealing with so many people. Paul was actually told Kemmerich is the 17th person to die that day, and they need to move the body because they actually need the bed. So he simply has to walk away. He takes Kemmerich's stuff, including the boots that Kemmerich has actually bequeathed to Muller, and takes them back to Muller. And that's where the chapter ends. And you're just like, okay, because Eric does not shy away from describing this poor kid's death throes. And Paul, in fact, associates him to other people he's seen dying. Big men who cry out for their mothers, who can do extreme damage to people, but literally are terrified of dying. And then this thin little kid who just weeps and weeps and weeps. And Paul's trying to dry his face off, but his handkerchief's too dirty, and the kid's just crying, and then starts to seize, and then dies. And he actually describes this death as Kemmerich's skeleton coming out from him. Like the kid is losing weight, and his eyes are sunken, so you could see his skeleton, you could see his bones sticking out. And it really does solidify what you're actually seeing here. But it's an interesting thing to consider the fact that this death scene is paired up with the basic training that these boys went through. And Hamiltos, whose just petty want of power was used to take advantage of what he could do to these boys. And how somehow that kind of worked out. So when you look at the chapter overall, it actually becomes this moment of realization for us that in some ways we maybe can't trust Paul as the narrator here. But not because he's outright lying. It does hint, though, that he is a storyteller here. His moment where he's speaking to Kemmerich about how he's not going to die, how he's going to be able to go to this recovery hospital that's really nice and play the piano. He is one of those people who, in the worst of moments, is trying to sort of paper over things. And we saw this a bit with his reaction to how Muller handles things in the previous chapter. He was actually the one stepping on Muller's foot every time Muller was going to be really blunt about something. Like, Muller was going to tell Kemmerich that he was missing his foot, but Paul's the one who stopped him there. So we have a narrator that's not reliable, but not because he's trying to trick us, simply because he is actually trying to deal with everything he's been through in a way he can understand it, and a way that he can come out from all of this. And this is given away in that first section of the chapter when he actually says that, like, we didn't have a life to return to. At 19, you're moving out of the power of your parents, but you haven't really entered that power of an additional relationship, like a marriage, yet. So you're at your most free moment here, and then you join the army and you're immediately stripped of that. So even with that, Paul here is telling stories to himself more than even us. We're simply here along for the ride. We're sort of riding on Paul's shoulders here, with an ability to see into his brain. So he's trying to understand things as well as he can. But the stark truth of the matter is really hard to address. So we get this really short section right at the start where he recognizes that they don't have anything to go back to, and then immediately he goes into this discussion of his basic training, that again, that's a story. He's saying, like, we didn't really have a past to return to in the future, and then he immediately tries to find something in the past. And he goes to basic training and how it's helped them survive and find camaraderie amongst themselves. He actually finishes his remembering of basic training by saying it taught them how to be comrades. So, from going to say we don't have anything in the past to look forward to, he immediately actually tries to give himself that. well, in the past I had basic training, and now I've got comrades, and together we'll get through this, and we'll have a life after this point. So we've actually got, from chapter 2, Paul, in a sense, trying to make sense of everything, but often shying away from how raw that truth can be. Like, he can admit that Muller comes across as really selfish, but that rawness and that selfishness is blocked in by the circumstances. If it were different circumstances, Muller would not be like this. Himmelstoss would not be like this. Kimmeruch would not be dying. But he has to recognize those circumstances and tell himself these stories to try and get through it. Because he is saying, if we didn't have basic training, we would go crazy in the trenches. But we've already sort of seen that happening, where these people are trying to survive, but they're not completely unaffected. Like, they get angry, they get sad. You've got big men who cry out for their moms. Because no basic training is going to be able to break you of the fear and the desire to live. And it comes back again to that first little warning at the start of the book, saying that, like, men who face death recognize that's not an adventure. That's a really terrifying thing. So, in telling the story of basic training, it feels like, again, Paul is trying to pull out that adventure aspect to it. Like, wasn't that some wacky times? But we showed that, Corporal, and we got mutual respect from it. He is trying to build a narrative of his own life that makes sense for how he got here and how he will continue on after this point. And he tries to do it with Kimmeridge as well. But focusing on that future thing. He actually admits he doesn't talk about Kimmeridge's mother to him. That weeping lady who didn't want her son to go to war. He talks about the pretty future they can have. But it is that moment for Kimmeridge where he can't pretend like any other possibility is even there. He is so ill and so close to death that the stories don't work. The truth is too stark and raw for Kimmeridge here, that all he can do is weep, because he probably recognizes what Paul is trying to do for him, but he can't buy into the story. He can't trick himself in this moment, because at the point of death you are laid out bare. Your skeleton is both literally and figuratively coming through in this moment. So Kimmeridge cannot turn away from what he's actually facing down. As much as Paul tries to help him do that, all he can do is cry. There is no other option for him. But you do see these moments of real honest-to-God humanity popping up, even when the doctor and the orderly seem really cold and inconsiderate. That's because they're overloaded. The doctor has cut off 5 legs today. 17 people are now dead. They have to shut it out, because that's the only way they can do their jobs. But Kimmeridge, in his moment of dying, is fully human in both in his inability to look away from what's happening, but also to recognize other people have to go on after this point. He does actually say to Paul that Muller can have his boots. And if Paul can find his watch, he wants that to go home to his family. He is thinking about these other people who continue on after he cannot. So this is a really humanized moment in probably the worst moment ever. It is this moment of death. Kemmerich cannot look away from it, but he's still a little boy who cares about his friends and cares about his family. And Paul is responding to that. He is trying to help his friend. But the coping mechanism here requires, just like every story does, the ability to suspend one's disbelief. And the truth is far too raw for Kemmerich in this moment to suspend that disbelief. But Paul, most of these stories are actually more for Paul. He knows Kemmerich is dead. He is trying to make sense of all of these things and provide stories about what he suffered in the past, how that's made him who he is, and how he will continue to go on after this moment. Because you see that right at the end. He heads back to his friends, he gives Muller the boots, and Muller actually pulls out some sausage and some rum, with the understanding that they were going to sit down and have a communal meal and a communal drink. Paul is telling himself stories, but they are precisely stories about friendship forming in the worst of places. And that's how he's going to get through this. He is not an island alone. He is in fact connected to all of these other people, and that's how he's telling himself he's going to survive. So we've got stories within the book itself that we need to be careful then to ask ourselves how honest Paul is being, and how much is he trying to protect himself and others from the raw and harsh reality of warfare in the trenches. And that's maybe going to be uncomfortable for us, simply because we know these people are suffering, so you want to give them as many chances as you can. So what if Paul is telling stories to himself? Isn't that what he needs? And that's it. We can recognize that, but we have to be aware of it, I think, as we go through, to try and see whether or not he's doing other people a disservice by shying away, or if he is actually telling the necessary white lies to make sure his own friendships, his own being, and his own society aren't crumbling away. It is the question of the noble lie. What does the community need to know and not know to be able to function and continue on from this point? But we need to be aware of it. And we need to ask ourselves if we're buying into that in our own way, and what damage is that actually causing then. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.